Have you ever felt like honesty about women has all but disappeared? That every discussion today seems to swing between two extremes, blind adoration or bitter resentment. It's either praise without thought or criticism without depth. What's missing is clarity. What's missing is truth. Modern society tends to paint women in a soft, untouchable light, nurturing, gentle, morally superior. But what if that image is not truth, but theater? What if this comforting portrayal is less a reflection of reality and more a cultural illusion? One so deeply ingrained that most people no longer question it. Over a century ago, one of philosophy's most controversial minds began to peel away this illusion. Friedrich Nietzsche, a thinker often misunderstood and rarely ignored, dared to confront the ideas that others avoided. He didn't hate women, nor did he idolize them. Instead, he examined them with a kind of brutal clarity that unsettles even today. While many of his contemporaries either dismissed women as intellectually inferior or placed them on unreachable pedestals, Nietzsche asked a more dangerous question: what lies underneath? Not what men wish women were, but what women are beneath the layers of roles, expectations, and fantasies society has projected onto them. And what he found was not cruelty, not inferiority, but something raw, something real, something powerful, and perhaps a little frightening. Not because it offends, but because it cuts close to something true. Nietzsche believed that the relationship between men and women was never truly built on equality, or even the kind of love celebrated in poetry and romance. Instead, he saw it as a dynamic shaped by instinct, by power, and ultimately by survival. And the more we look at the world today, the silent battles in dating, the confusion around identity, the struggle for control, the more his insights seem hauntingly relevant. This is not a manifesto for blaming anyone. It's not about shaming women or glorifying men. It's about stepping away from comforting lies and looking at the invisible forces behind attraction, control, and gender roles. Nietzsche never promised comfort. What he offered was something much rarer, the chance to see clearly. So if you're ready to set aside fantasy, if you're tired of recycled cliches and surface-level truths, then stay with me. Because once you begin to understand how Nietzsche viewed women, you may never look at love, power, or even yourself the same way again. Nietzsche believed that one of the greatest lies men tell themselves is that they truly love women. He argued that what men often love is not the real woman standing before them, with her complexity, contradictions, and instincts, but a mental image, a projection, an idea shaped by desire, fear, and longing for comfort. To Nietzsche, romantic love, at least as it's commonly portrayed, is not a testament to truth or connection. It is, more often, a well-crafted illusion, a performance of emotional safety. Men, in his view, don't fall for women as they are, but for a softened version they invent, one that embodies innocence, virtue, beauty, and emotional healing. And this fantasy, far from being harmless, is deeply deceptive. Nietzsche saw this as a form of self-delusion, not admiration. It's not that men worship women out of respect. Rather, they romanticize them to avoid confronting what he believed to be a more primal and less controllable reality. That women, like men, are driven by instinct, strategy, and a quiet will to power. In the idealized version of womanhood, women are gentle saviors, emotional anchors, morally elevated beings who redeem the chaos of the masculine world. But Nietzsche saw that image as dangerous because it's not grounded in reality. It's a coping mechanism, a way for men to hide from the unpredictability and strength of the female psyche. Instead of engaging with women as full human beings, men reduce them to comforting symbols, the angel, the muse, the nurturing mother. But when you strip someone down to an ideal, you erase who they truly are. You rob them of depth. And worse, you turn them into a mirror for your own emotional needs. In doing so, men unknowingly transform women into characters in their personal narratives, tools for self-validation rather than individuals with autonomy. Nietzsche found this not only dishonest, but also cowardly. It's easier, he believed, to invent a fantasy than to wrestle with truth. The truth, in his eyes, was that women are not lesser, not more virtuous, not morally superior, but fundamentally different. And in that difference lies a kind of strength that society often refuses to see. He didn't describe women as malicious or manipulative. What he pointed to was an instinctive intelligence, one shaped over centuries of survival in a world that denied them direct access to power. Nietzsche argued that this didn't make women weaker, it made them more refined in the art of indirect influence. While men assert themselves through domination, status, or brute force, Nietzsche believed women mastered a quieter form of power, not through commands, but through perception, emotion, and the ability to lead without appearing to do so. They became tacticians of subtlety, skilled in shaping outcomes without confrontation. And that, to him, was not deceitful. It was a kind of evolutionary brilliance. Men, Nietzsche suggested, often fear this strength. But they don't admit that fear. They disguise it as reverence. They call it love. They say, "She is so gentle, so good, so innocent," because facing the truth would mean dismantling the fantasy that has given them emotional safety for so long. It would mean admitting that the woman they think they love may not exist, at least not in the form they've constructed. And when reality inevitably breaks through, when the real woman emerges behind the mask, many men feel betrayed. Not because the woman changed, but because the illusion couldn't survive exposure to truth. For Nietzsche, this collapse of fantasy was not just a personal disappointment. It was a cultural tragedy, a shared delusion that weakens both men and women, one by denying reality, the other by being stripped of authenticity. In his relentless pursuit of truth, Nietzsche challenged us to stop mistaking fantasy for love and comfort for clarity. Only by dismantling the myths we carry about each other and about ourselves can we begin to form relationships not rooted in illusion, but in something deeper, more uncomfortable, and ultimately more real. Nietzsche never believed that women lacked strength. Quite the opposite. He believed their strength had been misunderstood, not because it was absent, but because it didn't fit into the masculine definition of power. In a world where dominance is often measured by loudness, force, or status, Nietzsche saw that women had developed a power that didn't shout, it whispered. And that whisper could echo louder and farther than any command. For most of recorded history, women were excluded from formal avenues of control. They couldn't command armies, write laws, or inherit kingdoms. But Nietzsche observed something extraordinary. Despite their exclusion, women still shaped the world, not directly, but through influence, through emotional precision, through their deep understanding of human nature. He didn't romanticize this skill. He respected it, but he also saw it for what it was, a survival tactic. When denied the right to lead openly, women learned to lead invisibly. Where men drew lines in the sand with swords, women redrew the boundaries of influence in silence. Through charm, seduction, timing, and intuition, they became tacticians in a game where the rules were never designed for them to win, yet they still found ways to bend the outcome. Nietzsche noticed that women had the ability to inspire action without giving orders, to create loyalty without demanding it, to provoke protection without ever appearing weak. Their power, he argued, was psychological, rooted in a refined awareness of what drives people, especially men: desire, ego, insecurity, pride. This wasn't manipulation in the negative sense. It was strategic adaptation. Women, he believed, had learned to navigate a hostile world by becoming fluent in emotional language. Where men wielded weapons, women wielded symbols. Where men raised their voices, women read the silences. This form of intelligence, Nietzsche believed, was no less impressive than overt dominance. It was simply more elusive and therefore more difficult to recognize or to resist. Society, eager to maintain the illusion that men ruled everything, was blind to this silent form of influence. It clung to the belief that women were passive and dependent. Nietzsche, however, saw women not as powerless, but as powerfully patient, masters of subtle warfare. While men sought control by stepping into the spotlight, women directed events from the shadows, where perception could be molded without confrontation. What made this even more formidable in Nietzsche's view was that women often didn't need to try. Their instincts had evolved to sense how to move people without pushing them. It wasn't a matter of deception, but of finely tuned awareness, a sixth sense for emotional positioning. He believed this instinctual strategy wasn't born from malice, but from necessity. A woman in a world built to exclude her from visible authority had two choices: surrender or adapt. Nietzsche admired that collectively women chose adaptation and perfected it. He warned, though, that this kind of subtle influence shouldn't be underestimated simply because it lacks volume. On the contrary, it's often because it is quiet that it becomes so effective. The person who never has to raise their voice often wields the most control. This quiet command was not a weakness. It was strength in a different dialect. The power of suggestion over force, perception over declaration, elegance over aggression. Nietzsche didn't view this as lesser. He saw it as evolutionary genius. He saw women not as victims of history, but as quiet architects within it. To him, this wasn't praise for femininity in the way society often means it: soft, pleasing, ornamental. It was recognition of a form of power that is deeply psychological, deeply human, and deeply misunderstood. And yet, that misunderstanding served a purpose. By being misread as weak, women preserved their leverage. The less they were seen as a threat, the more space they had to maneuver. In Nietzsche's eyes, the illusion wasn't that women lacked strength. The illusion was that they ever needed to ask for it. They had it all along, but they had it in forms no one wanted to name, and that, he believed, was precisely why their influence was so enduring. Nietzsche held a radical belief about human nature, that people are rarely driven by truth. They are driven by appearance, by the way things seem, not the way things are. And when it came to women, he saw this tendency taken to its highest, most refined form, not as a fault, but as an evolutionary necessity. In a world where women were denied direct power for centuries, political, physical, social, Nietzsche believed they mastered something even more potent: the art of perception. Not because they were shallow or vain, but because they had to survive in a system that valued how they looked and behaved far more than who they truly were. And in mastering the external, they gained leverage over the internal. He didn't accuse women of being false. On the contrary, he admired their ability to live with dual awareness, to know that the mask and the face are not the same, and yet to control both with precision. Women, in his eyes, became fluent in the language of appearance, of beauty, grace, tone, gesture, silence. These weren't mere decorations. They were tools, weapons, strategies. In a culture where a woman's value was tied to how she was perceived, Nietzsche believed the smartest among them learned to shape perception itself, to use appearances not as an escape from reality, but as a way to reshape it, to craft a version of themselves that could navigate a hostile world while protecting the core within. To Nietzsche, this wasn't about vanity. It was about survival with intelligence. If a man could gain power through strength or wealth, a woman learned to gain influence by understanding the emotional and symbolic language of her environment. She knew what others wanted to see and how to become it, without ever losing the awareness of what she truly was underneath. This mastery of performance, Nietzsche believed, was a form of power so quiet that most didn't even recognize it as power at all. That was its brilliance. That was its danger. A man might conquer a city, but a woman could conquer the man who conquered the city, simply by understanding how to direct his imagination. He saw that many men fall in love not with a person, but with a symbol, the idea of purity, the illusion of innocence, the fantasy of emotional safety, and women, consciously or not, learned how to embody those ideals in just the right doses to gain space, protection, and advantage. This wasn't deceitful, it was strategic adaptation, a response to centuries of systemic exclusion. In Nietzsche's view, the deeper truth was this: people don't fall in love with reality. They fall in love with what they want reality to be. And women, over generations, had cultivated the rare ability to shape that desire, to become the reflection of someone else's longing while never fully giving themselves away. That is not weakness, that is symbolic intelligence. This insight, he believed, shattered the simple narratives around love and gender. Because in a world where image is influence, the will to appear becomes just as important, if not more, than the will to be, and women, shaped by exclusion, perfected this will into an art. They understood the stage they were forced to play on, and they mastered the script without believing it. To Nietzsche, this wasn't a betrayal of truth. It was a way of bending truth to serve survival, a quiet genius of surface control that held sway over everything beneath it. In the end, what Nietzsche recognized wasn't that women had power in spite of their roles. It's that their roles were the power. They used what was available, and they used it to its fullest. In that space between how they were seen and who they were, women built an empire of influence that few men could even detect, let alone resist. Nietzsche never viewed love as a peaceful union of souls or the harmonious merging of opposites. To him, love was far less about unity and far more about conflict, a beautifully decorated battlefield where opposing instincts clashed under the mask of intimacy. It was not the end of struggle, but its most seductive disguise. He believed that men and women are not naturally aligned in their desires, but fundamentally different in their motivations. Yes, they are drawn to each other, but for entirely different reasons, and in that misalignment lies the seed of tension, a tension that society tries to dress up in romance and sentiment, but which never truly disappears. According to Nietzsche, men love idealistically. They fall in love not with the person in front of them, but with an inner projection, a symbol of salvation, softness, beauty, and emotional safety. Women, in contrast, love with sharper instincts. Their love, Nietzsche believed, is not born from fantasy, but from a deeply rooted strategy for survival. This contrast is not about calculation in the manipulative sense. It's about biology, culture, and the long evolution of the human will to power. Women, historically denied security and strength by society, developed an instinct to seek those things through connection. Love, therefore, became a kind of negotiation, an unconscious transaction in which protection, access, and stability were exchanged for affection, loyalty, or submission. Nietzsche wasn't condemning this, he was exposing it. And what disturbed him wasn't the nature of desire itself, but the dishonesty wrapped around it. Society, in his view, built elaborate lies to conceal this battle. It wrote poems about love while ignoring the control lurking beneath. It taught men to be heroes and women to be saints, all while hiding the power games happening behind the scenes. Beneath the roses and the vows, Nietzsche saw two individuals, each trying in their own way to win. Not openly, but through suggestion, through influence, through emotional leverage. And he argued that this quiet war was responsible for much of the suffering and confusion between the sexes. The tragedy, to him, was not that men and women wanted different things. It was that they refused to admit it. The illusion of equality in love, the myth that both sides want the same kind of connection for the same reasons, was, in Nietzsche's eyes, one of civilization's deepest deceptions. And because no one would acknowledge the game being played, both sides suffered in silence. Men felt betrayed when the woman they adored turned out to be more complex, more demanding, more independent than their fantasy allowed. Women felt disillusioned when the emotional strength they gave did not guarantee loyalty or protection. Both felt disappointed, but neither could say why, because both were clinging to illusions that were never real. Nietzsche refused to play along. He believed that every relationship, no matter how loving, involved an undercurrent of power, who leads, who submits, who influences, who yields. He didn't see this as evil. He saw it as inevitable. Human beings at their core are driven by the desire to shape their world, and that includes the people in it. So when two people fall in love, they don't simply connect. They enter into a psychological negotiation, a quiet struggle for influence and emotional territory. And the person who wins is often the one who appears to need less, the one who can love without surrendering the self. For Nietzsche, to love someone truly, without projection, without the need to dominate or be dominated, required immense strength. It required letting go of fantasy, giving up the desire to reshape the other into a role and facing them as they are, unpredictable, free, and not here to complete you. He did not believe many people ever reached that point. Most love, he argued, remains trapped in illusion. Men pretend they're saving women, women pretend they're submitting, but both are performing roles, not out of malice, but because they've been trained to do so by a society terrified of honest desire. In this sense, Nietzsche believed love is not the absence of conflict, but the refining of it. When acknowledged and understood, the tension between man and woman can become creative. It can become the ground where two wills meet, not to destroy one another, but to grow in opposition, like fire and wind, unpredictable but alive. But for that to happen, the illusions must fall. The man must release his need to be needed. The woman must release her need to be rescued. Only then, Nietzsche believed, can love evolve into something higher. Not peace, but truth. Not comfort, but clarity. Not control, but mutual becoming. Nietzsche never wrote about women to diminish them. He wrote to strip away the illusions that clouded how both men and women understood each other. His goal was not to insult, but to provoke awakening. To him, truth was sacred, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it shattered our most cherished ideals about love, gender, and morality. What many fail to see is that his insights were not born of bitterness, but of clarity. He wasn't trying to stir resentment. He was inviting us to face what we would rather avoid. That beneath the smiles, the rituals of romance, and the dance of seduction, there is something far more raw and real, the human will to survive, to influence, to protect, to connect, all wrapped in centuries of symbolic roles. He saw that most relationships were not grounded in honesty, but in mutual projection. Men chasing symbols of purity, women responding with strategic performance, both sides playing. A game they refuse to name. But what happens when the masks come off? What is left when neither seeks comfort in illusion or safety in control? Nietzsche dared to imagine something rare. A connection without disguise. A meeting of two individuals, not as savior and dependent, not as oppressor and victim, but as equals in their will, in their darkness, and in their capacity for growth. Not identical, but equally aware, equally free. He believed that true intimacy begins not when roles are perfectly performed, but when they are discarded. When the man stops trying to idealize and the woman stops trying to soften herself into what is expected. when both choose to confront the other, not with fear or fantasy, but with the full truth of who they are. Flawed, complex, instinctive, powerful. And that kind of connection, raw, real, untamed, is not for the faint of heart. It requires the death of comfort, the surrender of pride, the courage to be seen without defense. Few ever reach it. Most stay in the loop of illusion because it feels safer, predictable, easier to manage. But for those who dare, those willing to meet each other outside the lies, there exists the possibility of something extraordinary. Not harmony through control, but growth through conflict. Not a relationship built on roles, but a bond forged in truth. Not domination, but mutual transformation. Nietzsche never promised peace between the sexes. He predicted disruption. And maybe that disruption is necessary, because it breaks the old illusions and makes room for something truer to emerge. A new understanding, a new strength, a new kind of love, forged not in fantasy, but in fire.